Good afternoon all, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on cloud computing. My colleague Kayla will be taking us through the first section on cloud computing, which will be an introduction to cloud computing, talking about the different forms of cloud computing and some of the issues that are around cloud computing. Just briefly before Kayla does step in, my experience with cloud computing has changed over the years. I recall some 10, 12 years ago, just the word cloud computing was something of a taboo word, particularly in certain organizations, particularly in the financial services. You would have been crazy to have tried to put any of your confidential data at that stage, or that's what it was viewed as at that stage, as a very dangerous type of technology, and it was not adopted freely at that stage. If we fast forward to 10 years later, we can see how cloud computing has accelerated, how we've seen it, the uptake and adoption, and not even just looking at how most of your organizations use it. Cloud computing is touching all of us. Most of us use Gmail, for instance, use Apple Music or Spotify or Netflix. These are all examples of cloud computing. So it's a technology that is here to stay. It's ever evolving, and it's a technology that can provide many benefits, but also does provide certain risks, which of course can be mitigated. With that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Kayla, who will take you through the first part of the presentation, and I will take you through the second. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. So today, as Asavian has said, we will be discussing cloud computing, and we'll be addressing some of the topics which seem to be quite hot topics, things that people need clarity on, and what we've received quite a bit of interest in. So the first being, what is cloud computing? We'll give you a general overview, what technologies are involved, or what the cloud constitutes, your risks and challenges to embracing the cloud, the security measures that are required in order to mitigate any risks that may be present in cloud computing, and what to consider when negotiating cloud contracts. So what is cloud computing? Before we go into the nitty-gritty of the actual concept, I think it's quite important for us to understand what the cloud actually is. And so the cloud constitutes virtual servers that contain various applications and servers. And these applications and servers can be accessed from anywhere in the world, provided that you have an internet connection. So essentially what this actually means is that relying on devices for storage has become a thing of the past, and users can actually access any of their applications or databases from any device with an internet connection. So this slide reflects the various ways in which you can explain cloud computing, but as you can see, these explanations are quite technical. So simply put, cloud computing is a computing service offering, and it is provided using the cloud. And like I said, it is accessible from anywhere, provided that you have an internet connection. So how does this actually translate and apply to your business needs? Well, cloud computing enables a company to rent access to various cloud services, and this can include application, storage, infrastructure. So you'll rent it from a third-party cloud service provider instead of actually having to build and establish your own computing infrastructure or even your own data center, therefore offering companies an opportunity for faster innovation, flexibility, and many cost advantages from a scaling perspective. Cloud computing can be categorized into the deployment model and the service model. The deployment model refers to the way in which the cloud services are actually provided, and this comprises the public cloud, the private cloud, hybrid cloud, and multi-cloud, which is something that's recently been named as such. And the service model refers to the types of cloud services generally offered, and that comprises infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, as the general service offerings. So as a business, the deployment model chosen by you will depend very much on what your business requirements and needs are. And this is because not all clouds are the same. Not one type of cloud computing will be right for you or for everyone. And so when looking to operate a cloud computing business, companies will need to determine the most suitable deployment model for its business needs. And so let's take a look, or a deeper look, at some of the deployment models. The public cloud is just that. It's offered by a third-party cloud service provider to the public at large, and all hardware and software and the supporting infrastructure is then owned and managed by that cloud service provider. And you as a user will only be required to pay for the public cloud on a pay-as-you-use basis, therefore offering a lower cost option for cloud computing. Examples of this include Amazon Web Services, or otherwise known as AWS, and Microsoft Azure. On the other hand, the private cloud is established and owned exclusively by the company or organization itself. And it can either be physically located in the company's on-premise data center, or alternatively hosted by a third party. As you can imagine, establishing a private cloud requires a large upfront capital investment and is therefore more costly. However, it may be necessary for a company that, let's say, have access to or require access to extremely sensitive data, and they need to store that data in order to operate their business. They would opt for a private cloud in order to ensure the security and integrity of that data. Examples of the private cloud include HPE, VMware, and Dell and Oracle. The third model is the hybrid cloud, which is the best of both, and it is a combination of the private and public cloud, which is bound together by technology, and offers an organization flexibility to choose whether to use the private components or the public components of the model. So, for example, an organization can use the private component to store its highly sensitive information, but at the same time, the organization can use the public component to easily share data and information with the public if its business needs that. And then lastly, the multi-cloud. And like I said, this is a bit of a newer concept, but it seems to be one that companies are starting to enjoy quite a bit. And that's because of the flexibility it offers. So essentially what it does is it's using multiple cloud deployment models to support one or more application. And it can be used, or you can use components of the public cloud, of the private cloud. You can even do a mixture of it. And it's either used by vendors or by end users who don't want to be locked in by one cloud service provider, or who have a multifaceted business that each have their own requirements and needs, and they want to create a solution that is more diverse and incorporates more aspects of cloud services. Alternatively, it could also just be used for purposes of redundancy or system backup. So on the other hand, and the second part of the category of cloud computing is your software, your services model. And this consists of your infrastructure as a service, your platform as a service, and your software as a service. So looking at your infrastructure as a service, this would be used by an organization where the organization actually just needs the infrastructure, but it has all the other resources and expertise to build on that infrastructure in order to create a bigger solution, things like platforms or softwares. So what essentially will happen is that the IT infrastructure will be rented from the cloud provider on a pay for what you use model, generally used by IT administrators. And an example of an infrastructure as a service could be AWS again, Microsoft Azure, or Google Compute Engine. Platform as a service. So this is one step up. And you'll see on my next slide, the diagram kind of shows you the different components that the cloud computing service actually looks after. So on platform as a service, it'll be used when an organization requires both the infrastructure as well as the platform in order to enable it to build its software products. So it'll provide you with an on-demand environment for developing, testing, delivering, and managing your applications. And it allows software developers to deploy applications without having to actually establish any underlying or related infrastructure. And as I'm sure you've guessed, it is used mostly by software developers. And then lastly, software as a service is pretty much used by an organization who does not want to maintain any of its IT equipment, and it just needs access to a software that can be customized to its business requirements. So essentially what will happen is the provider will host and manage the software for the end user, and the software will be provided to the end user on a on-demand and subscription basis. Where all the hardware and software will be managed by the software as a service provider, and the end user will not be responsible for having to maintain anything. So as you can see by this diagram, it kind of reflects that infrastructure is primarily your services. PaaS is services plus the middleware, taking it one step up on the responsibility matrix, and software as a service is responsible for the entire solution, and it provides an end-to-end solution for its users. So as a business, and you need to obviously make an informed decision whether or not to move to the cloud. So in determining whether or not to do so, you need to understand possibly the main differences. Some of you may consider them being advantages or disadvantages, but we're going to explore a few of the main differences just to give you a taste of what you need to look out for and what your risk appetite is in accordance with that. So with on-premise, as you can see, you are responsible for managing each component. This is obviously costly. It limits scalability benefits. In other words, the company pays the same regardless of whether its business requirements result in an upward or downward scalability of its requirements and demand. It limits flexibility in that it does not give users an opportunity to access the data or information remotely, since it is all locally stored. And most importantly, from a data protection perspective, the on-premise model generally offers less security given the high costs associated with procuring hardware and software for data security. Going hand in hand with that is obviously the loss of data component. And because it is also so costly to replicate data, it's quite difficult to ensure data recovery. So from those aspects, it may not be as beneficial to you and your organization. Whereas if you look at the cloud, users only pay for what they use. So this is much easier for you and your organization to scale up or scale down based on your organization's demands. Also, there is generally better data security. That this is given the large investments that are made generally by third-party cloud providers to ensure that the security of their cloud and their storage model is at the forefront of their business's goals. And also from a data recovery perspective, generally cloud providers will store the data in multiple areas to ensure that if one server goes down, there are other areas where they can tap into and assist with data recovery, which also gives you stability in respect of your disaster recovery plan. Then when we look at infrastructure as a service, PaaS and SaaS, in comparison, this is also just a nice depiction of where the responsibility lies and what you are willing to do as an organization, and could possibly assist you in determining what the best option for your organization will be. And then lastly, from my side, before I hand over to Sabian, this is just showing you the general cloud service providers that you come across. We've got the AWS. These are very well-known brands. And I have no doubt that this list of service providers will just keep expanding, especially because South Africa is seen to be a hotspot for pushing cloud computing services. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. So Kayla's touched on the types of cloud services that are offered, the benefits with the cloud services. Now, I'll be the bearer of bad news a little bit before we. There are storm clouds, like every type of technology and innovation. It always presents itself with exponential benefits, but there are also risks associated with cloud computing. So with that in mind, let's discuss some of the risks to embracing the cloud. So the first one that I think most of you will probably be aware of and have probably faced if you've been involved in any cloud transaction or negotiation with a service provider is data security and privacy. The biggest concern for most consumers of cloud computing is centered around data security. As an organization, you will adopt the cloud, and some organizations adopt it on a global scale. That means your data is all in the cloud. Your risk to a data breach has increased as all your data is sitting in one area. According to a survey done recently in 2021 by Gartner, the respondents to that survey stated that one of their biggest challenges to cloud, or one of their biggest challenges that they face from cloud computing or adopting the cloud, was around data loss or data leakage. 62% went on to state in the very same survey that maintaining their data privacy was the second most challenge. So if you were to go about adopting the cloud, how would you consider to mitigate a risk of data security and privacy? Well, I think the first thing is you always have to ensure your data remains safe. Find out if your cloud service provider has safe and secure identity authentication, management and access controls. Interrogate your cloud provider, and you'll probably hear me say this term a few times during this presentation. Ask them the difficult questions. Ask them what sort of security they provide, against what factors. Do they have enough resources and expertise to handle your account or the type of data you're putting in the cloud if something goes wrong? The next risk I'd like to touch on is compliance risks. Compliance rules are getting more and more stringent. We've just seen over a year or 2 years and a bit, the full enactment of the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa, which governs the manner in which data can be processed, stored, and the manner personal information can be stored, processed, and when it can be taken out of the country and under what circumstances or requirements one should comply with. So what we're seeing is, again, in the very same survey that I spoke about earlier on, we've seen 44% of respondents state that their third challenge is around compliance and complying with legislation. So how would you go about considering how to mitigate this when you're discussing this with your cloud provider or evaluating which cloud provider to go with, or even which cloud service to adopt? For me, it's quite key that when you're choosing a vendor, you consider, is that vendor compliant with the standards or the legislation that you as your organization have to comply with? Many cloud providers can offer certified compliance, can also offer further certified compliance if they play in a specific field. However, it's very important for you as the consumer of the service to understand what are your core requirements of the service. What data are you actually putting in the cloud? How critical is that data to you? How sensitive is that data to you? The next item I'd like to chat about is reduced visibility and control. So I'd like to just take a step back. If we move back to prior or before the cloud was adopted, we had on-premise solutions. Naturally, with an on-premise solution, you have the comfort of having, I would say, complete and physical control over the asset or the software or the infrastructure. You usually see it in front of you. You have what I would call a traditional amount of control in the traditional sense of speaking. You can hold on to the asset, go see the asset. You have it at your fingertips. With cloud computing, it is a lot different. Here you are handing control over your data, over your infrastructure, or your software, depending what cloud solution you're going for. It may be all three of the above, but you are handing over control. You are trusting your cloud provider to ensure that they have the correct expertise, that they have the correct measures implemented, and you're trusting them just with the expertise in general. So again, before you go out and contract, understand what are your requirements around control, visibility, and access to your data. Is your organization an organization that still wishes to utilize the cloud, but still retain a form of control? This could be translated in perhaps moving to a more private cloud model versus a public cloud model. Obviously, being within a public cloud model, you adopt most of the service variants and service levels and terms as is. In a private cloud, you perhaps have more negotiating power to obviously specify your particular requirements. But in a private cloud, you must also remember the expense, your costs and expenses will also rise. Whereas there are benefits of elasticity in cloud computing, depending on what your demands are around configuration or how you actually want the specificities of your service to work. That will have a direct bearing on your costs. And next, another item to consider is migration of data. Clearly, when you're adopting the cloud, you may have adopted it already. You may be moving into a cloud for the first time. You may be moving from one cloud provider to a new cloud provider. All of this in all instances will require migration. So it's important, again, to understand what data are you migrating. Analyze your requirements. Determine exactly what are your security requirements. How critical is this data to your organization? What risk or loss will your organization suffer if that data is leaked? Is it just reputational? Does it go further than reputational? These are items that you would need to consider when migrating data. Incompatibility. Incompatibility here speaks to your own systems that are on-premise that may be migrated into the cloud now. The cloud will have a base operating system, and it will be very important for you to understand whether your current on-premise applications can be successfully transitioned and migrated into the cloud. Often what we see is, as usual, is with a lot of initial negotiations, a lot is promised by a cloud provider that, yes, we can move all of these things seamlessly, or the cloud will make your life easier. There'll be elasticity, scalability, and those are all true and correct summations by the service providers. But what they often forget to discuss with you is incompatibility with your systems. For instance, you could be embarking on a major project where you decide to put every one of your applications in the cloud. That may seem like a very simple exercise, but it's not that simple. You would actually need to consider, firstly, the compatibility of each application to determine if it will be able to be migrated to that cloud. Before that is even done, you would need to obviously look at the legal terms behind such on-premise solutions to determine if you can migrate it to the cloud. Do you need consent? Do you need to notify your supplier? These are all issues that need to be considered. If you do not consider the issue of incompatibility upfront, lower down or later down the line, you will find yourself out of pocket, because these are expenses that are not covered by the cloud provider. These are expenses or responsibilities that most cloud providers will look to push onto the customer, particularly if you haven't had a period where you allow the cloud provider to come in and do a limited due diligence of your environment, to understand the IT environment, to understand your organization's IT environment and landscape. The next item I'd like to touch on is improper access controls. Improper or inadequate cloud access controls and management can lead to various risks for an organization. Obviously, the biggest risk would be a data breach, or cyber criminals leveraging off such data, or web apps to steal credentials and access such data. In addition, organizations can also face what we refer to as password fatigue. I myself can tell you that I'm very guilty of this password fatigue. every month or 2 months, your organization will most likely send you a notification where you are obliged to change your password, or failing which you will be locked out of your system. Where I suffer from password fatigue is I'm very guilty of perhaps using the same set of passwords with simply changing 2 or 3 digits at the end. Furthermore, with improper access controls can also result in your organization being vulnerable to a data breach or a hack. How would you consider mitigating this? Well, organizations or entities or anyone that is adopting the cloud must have their own governance in place and must have proper data control and management for their data and user accounts to avoid such issues. All these accounts should be securely linked with a central governing authority to administer who can access the systems, and that a log is kept strictly to ensure and to be aware of which employees are accessing the systems and on what basis these systems are being implemented. The next item I'd like to touch on is lack of expertise. Cloud technologies are rapidly advancing, and more services and applications are being released to cater for different and specific needs. However, it's also becoming difficult for certain organizations to find skilled internal professionals that understand your cloud services. While there's no doubt when you outsource your services to the cloud, you will not have a large-scale IT team internally. However, you will still be expected to have certain individuals that understand the cloud in your organization, that understand the risks, the technical nuances, and the technical mitigations that are required. Downtime. Downtime, which I'll touch on further down when we also discuss SLAs, but I'll briefly touch on it here, is another critical item to consider about the cloud. What is downtime? The ability for you to access the system. Why are you actually using cloud computing? You may be going off-premise to use infrastructure as a service. You may be putting all your data in a data center. You no longer want to keep everything on-premise. You no longer want to have to maintain these servers, the data centers. In such instance, you'll contract with a cloud provider and put this in their data center. But what is the latency around this? How quickly will you be able to access your data? What is the availability around the system? These are items that need to be considered. It's no use having your data in the cloud, but having substantial downtime and having your employees and resources not being able to actually access the information that they require. This can lead to severe frustration and can further debilitate your business. Insecure APIs or insecure application program interfaces. So using an application interface or an API in cloud infrastructure enables you, in theory, to always implement better controls for your systems and applications. APIs are either built within the mobile app or within the web. I mean, examples of this could be used. An example of this would be a authentication API, where when you log into the system or log in to get your data over the cloud, it's not just the fact that you're logging into your laptop. There'll be two-factor authentication. However, if the wrong APIs are chosen, or APIs that do not have a high level of password encryption and encryption strength in general, you will find that your system or your access has vulnerability, and there is then the possibility of hackers, of an employee themselves to take data that they should not be entitled to take or access. Let's touch on environmental security. The concentration of computing resources and users in a cloud environment represents a concentration of security threats naturally. The more people using more resources using a cloud, more people putting data in the cloud naturally will expand and increase your risk. So how will you go about mitigating this? Well, again, interrogate your cloud provider. Ask them about what access controls they have. What vulnerability assessments do they do? Do they do penetration testing, which I'll touch on a bit later? What sort of configuration management controls do they have with respect to protecting your data? Disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is often, I find, an item that is overlooked with cloud solutions. And when I say overlooked, I'm not saying that cloud providers do not provide this service. They actually do provide the service. And usually most of them have comprehensive DR policies as to how they will handle your data in the event of a disaster recovery. But where I believe this is fundamentally overlooked is by the organizations themselves, because all organizations have their own data recovery policies. And often organizations do not align what the cloud provider is offering with their own with their own disaster recovery policies. In some instances, you may find that the cloud provider is actually offering you more comprehensive disaster recovery than what your own internal disaster recovery plans specify. But in other industries, for instance, if you play in the financial services industry, you would have very stringent requirements around your DR and disaster recovery and setting up DR, being able to access your data quickly. How often are backups done? When the system's gone down, when you switch the system back on, will you be able to access the data that you were actually accessing when the system was taken down? So these are all questions that need to be considered. And it's very important, again, to understand what your DR or disaster recovery requirements are first, and then consider what the cloud provider is presenting or providing, and then look at the gaps and see where you can actually mitigate those gaps. I want to touch on now security measures to manage and reduce some of the cloud risks that I've spoken about. Look, despite some of the concerns I've raised, and there is a fair bit of risk and cyber risk in adopting the cloud, there is still exponential benefit in adopting the cloud. Here are some steps that I believe that most organizations can adopt and take, and off the bat would limit or at least mitigate some of the risk that is presented by cloud computing. So I think the first item is always back up your data. I mean, this is an old mantra, and you'll hear it very often. It continues to be relevant in cloud. Extending control of your data to a third party shouldn't supplant that third party maintaining backups, or if for whatever reason you do not want that third party to maintain backups, then you need to be maintaining those backups. But it is extremely important, if you are looking to a third party to maintain the backups, to understand what data are they backing up, how quickly can you access the data, what latency is involved in that. The next item that can also mitigate some of the risk is web application penetration testing. Now, I touched on this early on. This could be most large cloud organizations that do specialize in cloud services themselves conduct their own penetration testing. And as stated earlier on, most of the major cloud providers such as AWS, Microsoft, Google, or Apple are spending billions on cloud security. So it's very unlikely in an instance where you're adopting a cloud solution from one of them that you would request to do penetration testing on their environment or on their cloud environment. What you would in all likelihood request is a certificate of proof or of some sort of undertaking that they've taken to do penetration testing once or twice a year. And have showed you where the vulnerabilities are and the mitigations and how they are fixing those vulnerabilities. Another mitigation factor is multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication requires 2 or more credentials to confirm a user's identity. It naturally cuts down threats posed by increased remote access. This would be done by logging into a web app, for example, which may require a password, as well as sending you a code to your customer, to your end user or your employee's smartphone. Geodiversity. Work with a cloud provider that stores data across servers in different locations, rather than only a single physical location. This can help and prevent loss of information or services should a particular data center be attacked or should a particular data center be offline. Reviewing cloud configurations. Misconfigured cloud services, such as often occur due to mismanagement of access rights. And this can be reviewed, mitigated quite simply from the get-go by reviewing what configurations and what access controls your cloud service provider has. I'd like to now briefly touch on issues to consider when contracting for the cloud. So let's touch on data ownership. I spoke early on about the traditional view of control and control of your data. So when software is on-prem, data ownership is not an issue. As you can see your data, it's physically in your servers. There's no need to segregate it. It is only your data. In the cloud, your data's location could be a cause of concern. For instance, a lot of companies would not want their data to be stored in a data center in the US due to certain legislation and the overreaching or far-reaching arm of the US government. State your data egress terms or your migration terms, for want of a better word. When you leave a cloud provider, you want your data back and you want it in a readable format. During the signing of a contract, nobody wants to ever discuss this point. It's often overlooked. However, the time to negotiate how you are able to obtain your data at exit or on termination should be done at the onset of contractual negotiations. Often parties do not consider this, and what actually happens is later down the line, when you for whatever reason you don't renew the contract or you choose to terminate the contract, you have to migrate your data. Whether you're bringing your data back on premise, you have to migrate it, or whether you're moving to another cloud provider, that cloud provider will have to migrate your data. Now, what format is that data going to be migrated? Is it going to be migrated in a format that can only be read on your previous service provider system or format? These issues can amount to massive cost implications if they are not considered and managed carefully. And the time to manage these issues are always at the beginning of the negotiation. Reviewing your security and privacy policies or your provider's privacy policies. When you contract for a cloud solution, depending on how that cloud solution is delivered, you often cannot change the cloud vendor's data security and data privacy configurations. This is one of the trade-offs you accept for the numerous advantages of cloud solutions, given, for instance, the scalability of a cloud service. However, what I would urge you to do is to make sure that your information security team, an IT team, or your chief information security officer is at least having discussions with the cloud provider, scrutinizing their security measures, looking at their privacy measures, along with your legal team, also looking at what data processing agreement they're putting forward, understanding what is being processed. There's also further protections. There's third-party certifications that a lot of cloud providers do obtain that certify that they have certain controls in place with respect to data privacy and safety. Very common certifications are SOC and SSAE. So there's also the ability for you to insist or at least request that the service provider show you that they are compliant with some of these certifications. Early termination fees. Early termination fees, ordinarily, I'm sure you're asking yourself right now, why should there be any termination fees in respect of a cloud service? Particularly if it's a public cloud service, there should not be. However, what happens when you contract with a cloud provider and you want to configure the system in a very specific way for your business needs? You could be an extremely large organization or enterprise. And this ultimately could lead to the cloud provider requiring to outlay a significant amount of capital. Perhaps there would need to be dedicated infrastructure for you. It wouldn't be shared. There may be a need for dedicated resources, for instance, if you require access to your data 24/7 or support or the system to be available 99.995. These would ultimately require more resources to be employed by the cloud provider or more infrastructure, certainly. So in such an instance, the cloud provider will want to insist that if you as the customer retain the right to terminate for convenience, then there should be a clawback provision for at least the service provider to claw back some of the sunken costs that they feel that they've invested. At the outset, this is not something that I would ever advocate or put in the contract. However, where you customize or configure the cloud, it is a debate that will always arise. So I'm not adversely against it. However, the fee should be reasonable, should be fair and reasonable. It should not be out of kilter or out of line with market standard. I've touched on audits briefly when we spoke of the different certifications. However, a further contractual provision that is key in your contracts is to ensure that if you cannot fight or force the negotiation for audit rights, a lot of major cloud providers will not allow your third-party auditors to actually just physically come into the environment. What they will allow, or some of them will permit, is to give a certification, and to perhaps even issue that certification every year, so that there's tangible proof for you to see that they have measures in place. Banded pricing. Many vendors will offer very attractive pricing to secure you as a client in the beginning, and that's great. But what happens when you need to increase your user count on the cloud or your resource count on the cloud? Often what happens is, as a customer, you will be hit with exponential price increases. Again, it's best to negotiate this upfront. Often you will hear clients or departments state, yes, but we only have 100 users right now. You do not know how your business is going to scale up. In a year, for instance, we had a client that had previously only needed something like between 50 and 70 cloud-based licenses. Their business grew. They were in a manufacturing industry. Their business grew exponentially to the point that they needed 2,000 licenses. And the cloud provider knew that this was going to happen, and stipulated a very, well, what I certainly viewed as an unfair and bad faith price increase, because the cloud provider knew that the consumer or the client was locked in and really had no way out right now, at least right at that point in time. Service levels. Service levels are very important. However, I think it's very important to also note what cloud model are you adopting? Is it public? Is it private? Is it hybrid? Where it's a public cloud, you're going to find a tremendous challenge. It is going to be a tremendous challenge to negotiate a stringent SLA or something that is very different from what the cloud provider is offering as its standard SLA. Typically, where you will naturally have more negotiating power is around service level, is around where you adopt the private cloud. Where you adopt the private cloud and you're configuring it in a certain way, you are going to naturally pay more. However, you're going to have more latitude, because if it's private, it is in all likelihood dedicated to you and your service, which means you can then push the service levels that you require. IP ownership. In most cloud contracts, IP disputes usually arise around, or the debate, I should rather state, arises around the configurations, particularly if you as a client has handed over a specification or configuration to the cloud provider as to how you want your system to be configured or your cloud service to be configured. And this configuration you may want this intellectual property in the configuration because it may give you a competitive or market edge. So what you're asking for here is not to actually own the source code of the cloud solution. You're asking that your actual IP configuration or specification that you actually put forward not be reused by the cloud provider in another industry. And often the cloud providers will not permit this at all. Then you'll get pushback, and the usual debate that comes up, or the usual answer, is that yes, but you're asking to almost own our core service then. That is not strictly correct. And the manner in which I've usually dealt with this or been able to deal with it is that to at least fight for some form of exclusivity of that configuration for a period of time. Where the cloud provider is not prepared to hand over the IP for that configuration, which may be understandable and may be justifiable, depending on the circumstance and the service that you've contracted for, I find that debating exclusivity for a short period of time may be more beneficial for you, particularly if it's given you a competitive edge or market edge. It's something that will be adopted at some stage, usually by your competitors. So perhaps insist on a period of exclusivity. Perhaps it's a 6-month period or a 12-month period, because usually after that, after that, after what early adopters have adopted, we find that the rest of the crowd follows. Licensing. When reviewing an agreement for cloud solution, a request for a perpetual license, for instance, does not align usually with how a cloud solution operates. A cloud solution will operate in the manner that you contract for it. It's a subscription. For instance, think about it quite simply as you subscribing to a newspaper, a magazine, or an online publication. You can use that service as long as you subscribe. The day you stop subscribing, it will no longer be accessible to you. Indemnities. Indemnities in all contracts are always a deal breaker issue. And naturally in cloud computing, they're a very big issue. Now, the indemnities that most cloud providers will offer without really putting up much of an argument will always be third-party IP infringement and indemnities for breaches of confidentiality, which will exclude data breaches or any breaches relating to privacy legislation. Now, these are the precise indemnities that you will actually need to fight for and ensure that you have in your contract. Indemnities that cover losses due to data breach, losses due to misappropriation of data, losses due to breach of any privacy legislation. And usually, ultimately, what happens is the service providers or the cloud providers are prepared to land somewhere in the middle and insert these indemnities in contracts, but it'll always be subject to a wider limitation of liability, which I'll touch on in the next item. So limitation of liability, again, is always a deal breaker ticket item and is usually a item that is usually dealt with last. So what are we talking about when we're talking about limitation of liability? How are you going to limit your losses, and how is the cloud provider going to limit their losses? Well, typically most cloud providers will limit their direct damages. You will find that they will try to limit their direct damages to the fees paid for perhaps a 12-month period preceding the date on which the claim arose. This is, strictly speaking, not the most ideal way of going about things. While I'm not advocating that you should be asking for uncapped direct damages, as that is not a market standard, I also do not believe that what I call one-for-one, receiving if you paid for a service, receiving exactly what you paid for that service is not going to put you in the position you were in prior to that breach occurring. And that's why I would always advocate, or at least insist, that a client push for a factor. So instead of 1 times, rather go for 1.2, 1.3. I've seen contracts that go up to 2 or 2.5 times, depending what the risk appetite is of the vendor. The next item to touch on limitation of liability is liability caps that would cover data breaches or misappropriation of data. As I stated early on under indemnities, cloud providers will usually be always be comfortable to give you the indemnity for any third-party IP infringement, the indemnity for any breach of confidentiality. However, that will exclude your personal information and data breaches. So this is where you ultimately have the debate. Cloud providers are never going to agree to uncapped liability for any data breach. And in some instances, most of them will not even accept indirect damages. So the best way around this is to firstly look at the service that you're contracting. Consider the data that you're putting in the cloud. What is the risk? What is the risk if there is a data breach? What is your risk exposure? Consider that. How much are you paying for the service? Then formulate a cap. And this will always be a cap that falls outside of the cap on direct damages and will usually always be a super cap. And the last item I'd like to touch on is understanding the practical and business implications. It's pretty self-explanatory when you think about it, but a lot of the time people forget to actually do this, understanding why did you actually want to go in the cloud? What were your actual business requirements at that time? What are your requirements going to be moving forward? What your requirements are today in 1 year are going to drastically change a year later. That's the way technology works, and that's how fast organizations are evolving. So you need to understand what your business implications are. And how do you do this? Well, it's not just good enough making this an IT department or a technology area problem. It needs to be a technology consideration. It needs to be a commercial consideration, and it needs to be a legal consideration. All three of these clusters should be involved at the outset of the discussion with the cloud provider. So we've touched on cloud computing and we've discussed some of the risks. So in concluding, we've seen that there are substantial benefits of the cloud, and there are also substantial risks. However, the cloud is here to stay, and it is only going to become more powerful. It is not without risk, but I think the best way to always go about this is always ensure that your legal team, whether it's external or internal, is involved at the very start of the engagement. Thank you very much, and we'll take questions now.
Sabian, there seems to be one question on the chats from Sipusisu saying ransomware. What are the pitfalls? Is there a way for gauging the risks and what to do if something happens?
Okay, well, with ransomware, look, it's again, gauging the pitfalls depends on obviously what data has been taken from you and the sensitivity around such data. Obviously, what mitigations do you have around that? I mean, if that were to happen today, for instance, you would have a duty to notify the regulator, the information regulator about that. What we've seen recently is contractually, you won't naturally or necessarily find a cloud provider that's going to contract for that. But what we've seen is that a lot of consumers or clients of ours have taken out cybersecurity insurance and cyber insurance, which is geared towards particularly dealing with ransomware, dealing with these sort of issues. So I would urge you to consider looking at some of the cybersecurity insurance and what is out there. Obviously, first prize would always be to try and negotiate and push for that in your cloud or security provider's contract. But naturally, most providers will be reluctant to agree to anything, given that the way technology and IT and data works is that you could have the best measures in place, but usually someone does find a way to break it, and then you have to mitigate it and close that loop.
And just to add on to that, I think, what Sabian said as part of the mitigation steps was reviewing the information security policy of the supplier. And in doing so, you can identify if there are any gaps in their security processes. And if so, you can try and incorporate a clause to give you some security and comfort within your actual agreements. But also just knowing that they have those steps in place, that they are compliant with the Cybercrimes Act and the processes stipulated in that should give you some type of comfort from a legal perspective, whether or not ransomware would be a massive risk.
Okay, thank you. I saw a question just around liability and how to reach the middle ground. Look, from the outset, limitation of liability is always a deal breaker ticket item. Factors that obviously have an impact on this is how big the deal is, what is the risk exposure, what is the benefit obviously to the cloud provider, is it a significant, massive deal where they are prepared to make concessions. That being said, what we're seeing as the market standard certainly in the last 18 months is that cloud providers naturally will not accept more than 2 times the damages, direct damages. And in all likelihood, with the big players being the Microsofts, the AWSs, the Googles, the Apples, what you're going to find is you're going to have to push very hard to get 1.5 or even 1.6 times the damages, the factor for direct damages. Around losses due to third-party IP claims or breaches of confidentiality, excluding third-party, excluding data privacy or personal information or any sensitive data, we're seeing that suppliers or cloud providers are more than willing to put themselves on the line there. And on the contrast, where we're seeing heads of losses, where you want to be able to claim for breach of applicable law or breach of any data laws or misappropriation or corruption of data, we're seeing massive pushback there. And over there, what we're seeing is suppliers are, once they're pushed hard enough, will agree to a super cap for that data breach. But ultimately, that amount depends on the exposure, what data you're putting in there, the size of the deal. I'm just seeing, sorry, another question. Is it suitable to use AWS Cape Town versus, let's say, AWS in Ireland, considering POP here applies in SA instead of casting a net to what is the laws in Ireland? Look, if you, for starters, even if you were to use Ireland as your destination, you'd have to have a data processing agreement in place with the Irish entity. You'd have to ensure that you have the cross-border data transfer agreement in place. So it's for me, it's immaterial in that sort of sense, where your data is being placed, if you had to choose between Ireland and South Africa, because both jurisdictions have data privacy legislation in place. Perhaps the Irish, where I would stipulate is Ireland is more mature in data privacy legislation, and perhaps the Irish regulator has been seen to be more commercially minded. However, for instance, where I would obviously urge you or urge you to take caution or take a more of a cautious approach, is where data is going to be put in, for instance, housed in America, for instance. And you may be asking yourself, yes, but the likes of Microsoft, etc., are all headquartered in America. And yes, that is correct. But some of you may have heard of the Cloud Act, which allows, and sorry, I'm just using that as an abbreviation, which does allow the US government to extend its reach based on the fact of if it's an American domicile company and any data has been processed, etc., on that infrastructure, with a court order, they would be able to get access to that data. Now, why I bring that up is 3 or 4 years ago, there was a case, I think it was in New York, there was some sort of crime was committed, and it was in a Microsoft, the data was housed in Microsoft, and that actual data set or sect or data message or portion of data was sitting in the Microsoft Ireland data center and was not sitting in the US data center. The district attorney, I think for New York, or state attorney, went forward and got a court order, etc., served it on Microsoft in America and said, okay, thank you very much. You can hand over the data now to us. Microsoft took a very different approach, an approach that served itself very well and all the other cloud providers. Microsoft said that, I'm afraid that data sits in Microsoft Ireland, PT Limited, and you need to go to Ireland. We're not saying you can't get the data. All we're saying is that we do not see the validity of your court order here to access data in Ireland. You need to go to Ireland, go to court in Ireland, present your case there, and if that court rules that we should hand the data over, we will hand the data over. And we've seen this position adopted by Google and Apple. And in fact, in this very case that I'm mentioning, Google and Apple did join the case as interested parties.
Apologies, I do have a hard stop at 3, yes. And I'm not sure if you can carry on.
I unfortunately also have a hard stop, but I'm more than happy. Any questions that are not answered, Kayla and I will respond to them within the next few days. Our marketing team will just let us know about those questions and we will respond to you. And if any of you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to Kayla or myself. And thank you all for attending.